The bride was ridiculed by the entire village for being too fat. But the quietest cowboy in the mountains stepped forward and took her hand in front of everyone. Mabel Cross's wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but instead it became the most cruel public humiliation Coldwater Valley had ever witnessed. The groom left, the crowd laughed, and Mabel stood there alone, in her ill-fitting wedding dress, amidst a circle of people who couldn't stop laughing. But then, a tall figure emerged from the crowd. Rhett Boone, the man the whole mountain feared, and he held out his hand to her. Like, comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. And remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts. The morning Mabel Cross was supposed to get married, she woke up before dawn and lay still in the dark, listening to the wind come down off the mountains. It had a sound to it that she'd never been able to describe to anyone. Not mournful exactly, not threatening, just utterly indifferent. Like the mountains didn't care what happened in the valley below, like they'd been there before any of this and would be there long after. She told herself that was a comforting thought. She didn't entirely believe it. Her mother was already moving around downstairs, the floorboards announcing every step. Mabel stared at the ceiling and counted the knots in the wood, something she'd done since she was a girl whenever she couldn't sleep. And she thought about Curtis Hale and what his face looked like when he smiled at her, and she tried to hold on to that image because it made her feel something warm in the center of her chest, and she needed that warmth this morning more than she needed almost anything else. She was 26 years old. She had spent most of those years being the woman other women pitied and other men overlooked. In Coldwater Crossing, which was what the settlement at the base of the Grayvale Range called itself, though crossing implied something more significant than a single rutted road and 40-some-odd structures, a woman of Mabel's size and circumstance didn't have many options. You kept your head down. You worked. You tried not to want too much because wanting too much only made the gap between what you wanted and what was actually available to you more obvious to everyone around you. Curtis Hale had seemed like a miracle. That was probably the first sign she should have been more careful. He wasn't a cruel man, or at least she hadn't thought so. He was a farmer with a modest plot on the eastern side of the valley. Not prosperous, but not struggling either. And he had a way of talking to her that felt different from the way most men talk to her. Not like he was doing her a favor by acknowledging her existence. Not with that particular exhausting quality of reluctant tolerance she'd learned to recognize in people's voices. He'd been direct, almost businesslike about it, which she'd mistaken for honesty. "You're practical," he'd said, the evening he'd come to discuss the arrangement with her father. "You're not the kind of woman who's going to have her head turned by every shiny thing that comes through. That's useful." She'd told herself that was a compliment. She'd been so hungry for something that wasn't mockery that she'd swallowed it whole without examining it too closely. Her mother appeared in the doorway holding the dress, and Mabel made herself sit up. The dress was the problem they'd been dancing around for 3 weeks. Her mother had made it herself, had worked on it late into the nights, and it showed the kind of love that comes out in careful, invisible stitches. But the woman who'd been measured for it in early autumn was not quite the same woman who'd been eating her anxiety all through the weeks leading up to the wedding, and the result was that the dress fit the way a too small hope fits a too large reality. Technically there, technically functional, but strained in ways you could see if you looked. "It's fine," Mabel said, before her mother could say anything. "Mabel, it's fine, Mama. It's going to be fine." She believed that, or she tried to. She was good at trying. Coldwater Crossing's main road wasn't much, but it was what they had. And on a wedding day, the whole settlement turned out. This was both a feature and a problem of small frontier communities. Everything was collective. Joy was collective. Grief was collective. And humiliation, when it came, was very much collective too. Mabel walked the road to the meeting hall on her father's arm, and she could feel the eyes on her the way you feel weather coming. A pressure, a change in the air around her. She heard the whispers before she was close enough to make out words. She didn't need to make out words. She'd been hearing that particular register of whisper her whole life, and she knew its shape. The hall was full. That was the thing she noticed first, and for just a moment it swelled something in her. All these people, here, for this. She'd spent so long being invisible, and here was a room full of people gathered for the event of her life. For just a few seconds, she let that feel good. Curtis Hale was standing at the front of the room beside the justice of the peace, a man named Gruber, who smelled permanently of pipe smoke and whose eyebrows were so large and expressive they seemed to conduct their own separate conversations. Curtis was wearing his good shirt. He was looking at her as she came through the door. She smiled at him. He looked away. The whispers got a little louder. She told herself she was imagining the quality of them. She wasn't. It happened in stages, which was almost worse than if it had been sudden. She walked the length of the hall, her dress pulled across her shoulders with each step. She watched Curtis watch her approach with an expression that she tried very hard to read, as nerves, as the natural anxiety of a man on his wedding day, because that was an explanation she could work with. That was something human and manageable and not the thing she was beginning to actually understand was happening. She stopped beside him. She could smell the starch in his collar. For a moment, nothing happened. Gruber opened his book. The room was very quiet. Then Curtis Hale took one step back. Just one. It wasn't dramatic. It barely looked like anything. But Mabel felt it like something physical, like the floor had shifted, and she turned to look at him because she needed to see his face, and his face would tell her, "I can't do this," he said. Not loudly. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, in the voice of a man who has made a practical decision and wants to be clear about it without being cruel. "I'm sorry, Mabel. I can't." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then someone laughed. She didn't know who, didn't see who, and it didn't matter because once the first one started, the rest followed like water finding a crack. It wasn't everyone, wasn't even most of them, but it was enough. A ripple of sound that spread through the room and changed the character of the air. And suddenly she was standing in the middle of it, in her too-tight dress, holding flowers she'd picked herself that morning. And the thing that had been the best hope she'd had in years was evaporating in front of an audience. Curtis walked past her. She felt the movement of air as he went. She heard his boots on the floorboards, and then the creak of the door. And then she was just standing there with Gruber and his enormous eyebrows and a room full of people and nowhere to put her face. "Well," said a woman somewhere behind her, making no effort to lower her voice. What did she expect? "Bless her heart," said another, which in the language of Coldwater Crossing was not a blessing. Mabel stood very still. She was not going to cry. That much she had decided in the first 3 seconds. She was not going to give them that, not going to collapse in the middle of this hall and become the spectacle they apparently already considered her to be. She focused on a point on the far wall. A nail, just a nail, with nothing hanging from it. And she breathed. Her father had gone rigid beside her. She could feel the shame radiating off him, and she knew without question, that his shame was partly for her and partly because of her, and that was its own kind of wound. She didn't look around the room. She didn't search faces for sympathy because she couldn't afford to find none. She just stood at the front of that hall with the laughter dying down around her and tried to figure out what came next. And the honest truth was that she had no idea because she had planned for this day carefully and thoroughly, and she had not planned for this. "Miss Cross." The voice came from the back of the hall. It was a low voice, not particularly loud, but it had a quality to it that made people turn, something in the register of it, something even and unhurried. The kind of voice that doesn't need to raise itself because it already occupies more space than most sounds. She turned. She knew who Rhett Boone was the way everyone in Coldwater Crossing knew who Rhett Boone was, by reputation rather than familiarity, by the stories that accumulated around certain people whether they want them to or not. He came down from the high country a few times a year for supplies. He was taller than most men by several inches, and broader across the shoulders than seemed quite practical, and he had a face that looked like it had been carved out of something that doesn't yield easily. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that had seen some weather. He didn't talk much when he came to town. He didn't laugh at other people's expense. He paid for what he bought, and he left. People left him alone because something in his manner suggested very clearly that this was the appropriate response to his presence. He was standing at the back of the hall now, near the door, and everyone had gone quiet because Rhett Boone didn't generally speak in public gatherings, didn't generally involve himself in other people's business. and the fact that he was doing both of those things right now had redirected everyone's attention with startling efficiency. He was looking at her, not at the room, not making a speech for anyone else's benefit, just looking directly at her with those dark eyes that gave away nothing and everything simultaneously, and she had no idea what was about to happen. He walked up the center of the hall. People moved aside without him asking them to. When he reached the front, he stopped 2 feet away from her, and she had to tip her chin up slightly to meet his eyes, and she could feel every person in that room holding their breath. "I have a homestead up in the high country," he said. "It's not much to look at. The winters are hard and the work is harder, and I'm not easy company." He paused for just a moment. "But it's mine, and what's mine, I keep, and I could use a partner who knows how to work." Mabel stared at him. "That's your proposal?" she said, because she was too stunned to be polite about it. Something moved in his face. It might have been amusement. It was difficult to tell. "It's not much of one," he allowed, "but it's honest." The room had gone completely silent. Whatever entertainment they'd expected from this morning, this wasn't it, and the confusion of that was almost visible on the faces around them. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." "What does that mean?" "Means I've been coming to this town for 8 years, he said. "And in 8 years I've watched you work. I've watched you deal with people who treat you poorly and not give them the satisfaction of seeing it land. I've watched you help your neighbors when they needed it and not make a production of that either." He glanced briefly at the room full of people watching them. "I know what kind of person shows up when things aren't easy. I've been paying attention." She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with any of this. Her mind was moving very fast and coming up with very little of practical use, because nothing in her experience had prepared her for this particular moment. "You'd be doing me a kindness I can't return," she said. It cost her something to say it, but she said it anyway because she needed him to know that she understood what was happening, that she wasn't so desperate she'd pretend otherwise. "I wouldn't be," he said. "I'd be making a practical arrangement with a woman who has better sense and more backbone than most people in this room put together." He said that last part without heat, just as an observation, as if the people around them were weather or geography, real, present, and largely irrelevant. "Come with me, Miss Cross. If after 3 months you decide it doesn't suit you, I'll bring you back myself and no hard feelings. That's—" She stopped. 3 months. "After 3 months, if you stay, it's because you want to." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his face, which was not a comforting face exactly. Not the face of a man who would tell you everything was fine when it wasn't, but a face that seemed to have made a long peace with the truth of things. She thought about the room behind her. She thought about her father's rigid shame. She thought about Curtis Hale walking out the door, and the nail on the wall she'd been staring at, and the sound of that laughter. She thought, what do I actually have to lose? She took Rhett Boone's hand. It was a large hand, rough across the palm, and it closed around hers with a steadiness that she felt go all the way up her arm. She heard the intake of breath behind her, multiple, simultaneous, as if the room had a single pair of lungs. She didn't look back. 3 months, she said. He nodded. 3 months. They walked out of the meeting hall together, and she heard the doors close behind her, and the cold mountain air hit her face, and it was sharp and clean, and it smelled like pine and stone, and nothing at all like the inside of that hall, and she breathed it in and thought, all right then. Whatever comes next, all right. She went back to her parents' house to change her clothes and collect what she had, which wasn't much. A trunk, a sewing kit, her mother's extra blanket, a small collection of books that had survived various hard years, her father's old hunting knife, which he pressed into her hands without explanation, and which she understood to be both a practical gift and an apology. Her mother stood in the kitchen doorway watching her pack. You don't have to do this, her mother said. I know. Mabel. Her mother's voice changed. Baby, you don't have to. I want to, Mabel said. And then, because she owed her mother the truth, even if she couldn't fully explain it, I've been small here my whole life, Mama. Not because I am, because everyone here has decided I am, and I've let them. She folded the blanket carefully. I don't know what's up in those mountains, but I know what's down here, and I know I'm done with it. Her mother pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't try to hide that, which was one of the things Mabel had always loved about her. "He's not a talker," her mother said finally. "I noticed. You'll have to figure him out." "I'll have to figure out a lot of things." Mabel closed the trunk. "I've done it before." She hugged her mother for a long time. She shook her father's hand, and he held onto it a beat longer than necessary, and she understood that too. Then she carried her trunk out to where Rhett Boone was waiting with a wagon and a mule that looked like it had come to terms with its existence through hard-won philosophical acceptance. He loaded the trunk without comment. She climbed up onto the seat without asking for help, because she had learned long ago that waiting for help was a gamble she usually lost. And they moved out of Coldwater Crossing with the mountains rising ahead of them and the settlement falling away behind. No one came out to see them off. That was fine. She hadn't expected it. The road, if it could be called that, climbed steeply out of the valley. Mabel had grown up in the shadow of the Grayvale Range and thought she understood the mountains, but understanding something in silhouette and understanding it close up are entirely different things. The trees grew denser as they climbed, the kind of dense that muffles sound and changes light, turning everything green-gray and cool. The cold deepened with the altitude. She pulled her coat tighter. Rhett drove with the focused economy of a man who'd made this particular journey many times and found it required his full attention rather than conversation. She studied his hands on the reins, those same large, steady hands, and the way he read the terrain ahead, small adjustments, constant. He was watching everything. She got the impression he was always watching everything. They were an hour out of town when she decided that if they were going to spend 3 months sharing a homestead, she needed to know something. "Why?" she said. He didn't look at her. "Why what?" "You know what?" He was quiet for a moment, navigating around a washout in the track. "You want to know why I stepped forward?" "I want to know the real reason, not the polite version." Another pause. She appreciated that he didn't immediately reach for an easy answer. "I've watched Curtis Hale for years," he said finally. "Watched him work that field and heard him talk and listened to the way he talks about the people around him when he thinks no one important is listening. He's the kind of man who sees everything as something that can be traded for something better." He kept his eyes on the road. "When I heard you two were going to marry, I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business, but I made a note of it. And when I saw him walk away from you in front of that room full of people," he stopped. "What?" "I don't like cowardice," he said, "and I don't like cruelty. And what he did was both." "That's why you stepped in? Because you were offended on principle?" "I stepped in," he said slowly, "because I've been watching you manage this valley's poor opinion of you for 8 years, and you've done it with more dignity than the people handing that opinion out deserve. And because—" He stopped again, seemed to weigh something. "I've been alone in those mountains for a long time. I've been telling myself I prefer it. Maybe that's been less true than I thought." She looked at the side of his face for a moment. "That's still not a good reason to marry someone." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's an honest one." She thought about that. "All right," she said. They didn't talk for another hour after that, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the closed-off silence of two strangers, but the quiet of two people who had said a real thing and were sitting with it. She found, to her surprise, that she didn't mind it. The homestead appeared around a bend in the track like an afterthought in the landscape, which it somewhat was. Rhett had built it himself over several years, adding on as need required and material permitted, with the result that it had the irregular, practical architecture of something that grew rather than something that was planned. A main cabin, solidly built, if not pretty, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that looked like it meant business. A barn that leaned slightly east but showed no particular interest in leaning further. Fences in various states of repair enclosing pasture that rolled upward toward the tree line. Beyond the structures, the mountain rose steep and enormous, close enough that it felt like a wall, like a presence, like something that had opinions about you. Mabel sat in the wagon and looked at all of it. "It's not," Rhett began. "It's fine," she said. And then, because that felt insufficient, "It's solid. The cabin's solid. Drafty in a north wind. We'll fix the drafts." He looked at her sideways. You done much building? I've done much figuring out, she said. That's close. He almost smiled. She saw it happen and then stop, like a reflex he'd learned to interrupt, and she filed that away. The inside of the cabin was spare and orderly in the way of a person who lives alone and has reduced their requirements to essentials. A table, 2 chairs, an iron stove that was clearly the most important object in the room, a shelf of supplies that he kept with the organized precision of someone who understands that, in the high country, knowing exactly where everything is can be the difference between managing and not managing. A single bed against the far wall. She stopped at the single bed. I'll take the floor, he said, without inflection, until we can sort out a better arrangement. I'm not taking your bed. You're not taking the floor. She turned to look at him. He was absolutely serious, and she understood that this was not something he was going to argue about, and she also understood, from some quality of his steadiness, some fundamental bedrock thing about him, that there was no edge in it, no performance, just practicality offered without condition. Fine, she said, but I'll build the cot. You know how to build a cot? I'll figure it out. He looked at her for a moment. I have lumber in the barn, he said. She built the cot over the next 2 days. It was not by any objective measure a perfect cot. One leg was slightly shorter than the other 3, which she solved by wedging a piece of bark under it, and the rope lacing sagged more on the left side than the right, which she solved by sleeping on her right side. But it held her weight, which was the essential requirement, and she had built it with her own hands from materials she'd measured and cut herself, which was something else. Rhett watched this process with the observant quiet that she was learning was simply how he inhabited the world. He didn't offer advice she didn't ask for. He didn't interfere. When she went wrong with a measurement and had to redo a cut, he was somewhere else in the barn and didn't notice, or if he noticed he didn't mention it, either of which she was equally grateful for. On the 3rd evening, he showed her the property lines. He walked her through the homestead in the late afternoon light, pointing out fences, natural landmarks, the spring that fed fresh water to the cabin, the stand of timber he'd been careful not to overcut. He explained things with the efficient precision of someone who had learned them through long practice and understood their importance so thoroughly that he didn't know how to be casual about them. The south fence needs work before winter, he said. I've been putting it off. What needs doing? He looked at her. Most people, she'd observed, asked questions like that and then waited for the answer as information they would file away for future reference. Rhett seemed to be recalibrating something about her. Posts are rotted through at the corners, he said. Need pulling and replacing. It's heavy work. I can do heavy work. Mabel. He said her first name for the first time, and she noticed it, the way you notice a first step on uncertain ground. Careful, waiting. I'm not going to handle you like you're made of something fragile, but I'm also not going to pretend that pulling fence posts out of mountain soil is easy for anyone. Good, she said, because if you started handling me like I was fragile, I'd have to reconsider our arrangement. Something in his expression shifted, and this time he let the almost smile actually become a real one, brief and a little crooked, and she thought, oh, there's a person in there. The fence posts, he said. Tomorrow, after breakfast. On. The work was brutal. She'd known it would be, and she'd told herself she was prepared for it. But there's a gap between knowing something in theory and experiencing it in the frozen ground of a mountain autumn, pulling against posts that have been planted there for years and have no particular interest in coming out. Her hands blistered by mid-morning. Her back made complaints she'd never heard from it before. At one point she lost her grip and sat down hard in the dirt, and she sat there for a moment, just catching her breath while the mountains stared down at her with that magnificent indifference. Rhett crouched down beside her. He handed her a strip of cloth for her hands without comment. I know how to stop a blister, she said. I know you do, he said. There's the cloth anyway. She took it. It gets easier, he said. You said this work was hard. It does both, he said. It gets easier and it stays hard. You get stronger and the work gets more demanding. I've been here 6 years and I don't have easy mornings. He looked at the fence line. But I have mornings I'm proud of. That's different. She wrapped her hands. She stood up. She pulled the next post. October turned to November the way seasons turn in high country. Not gradually, but all at once. One morning, you wake up and the world has been rearranged while you weren't looking. The first snow came on a Tuesday, just a dusting, enough to coat the ground and silence everything and make the cabin's firelight look like something from another century. The second snow came 3 days later and was serious about it. She learned things that month. She learned how to bank a fire to hold through the night. She learned which of the two horses, Rhett had two, a gray and a bay, had opinions about being approached from the left. She learned to read the weather by the behavior of the wildlife around the homestead, because Rhett was good at this and explained it without being condescending about it, just pointing out correlations until she could see them herself. She also learned things about Rhett Boone that no one in Coldwater Crossing seemed to know or had bothered to find out. He'd grown up on a homestead 2 territories east, youngest of 4 brothers, the kind of family where tenderness was not exactly rationed, but was expressed in ways you had to know how to read. He'd come west in his early 20s after a conflict with his family that he described only as a disagreement about the future of the land, and she understood, from the way he didn't explain further, that it was something that still sat wrong in him, something he'd made a kind of peace with that wasn't quite peace. He cooked the same 4 things with equal competence and no passion whatsoever, which she solved by taking over the cooking after 2 weeks, which he allowed without comment, but which she noticed made him stop by the stove more often in the evenings, as if the smell of something decent was a thing he'd been missing without knowing it. He read. This surprised her. She'd assumed a man who lived so far from town had made his peace with silence as a total environment, but he had a shelf of books, worn, evidently reread, with the particular softness of books that have been handled in cold hands for years. History, mostly. Natural science. A single novel, Ivanhoe, so old the spine had been repaired twice with strips of leather. Did you like it? She asked, one evening, touching the spine. I've read it 5 times, he said, not looking up from what he was mending. Make of that what you will. She made of it. This is a man who is loyal to things, who returns to them, who doesn't leave easily. She filed that away. Son. The news from Coldwater Crossing came up with the supply rider in mid-November, and it wasn't good. The man's name was Pruitt, a weathered person who made the mountain run twice a month and had opinions about everything and the discretion to share them only when he thought they were useful. Silas Vane's been making the rounds, Pruitt said, accepting coffee in the cabin doorway. He never came in, some principle he operated on that she'd decided not to question. Buying up land claims, or convincing people to sell their claims, or, he paused, convincing them in ways that aren't exactly voluntary. Rhett was very still. Which land? Started on the Eastern Valley. Moving west? Pruitt met his eyes. He's been asking questions about this parcel too, Rhett. I thought you should know. After Pruitt left, Mabel watched Rhett sit with that information for a long time without saying anything. He was looking at the fire with the focused attention of a man who is working through something that has multiple components and none of them simple. Who is Silas Vane? She asked. Cattle baron, Rhett said. Came up from the south 2 years ago, started small, turned into something bigger and meaner. He paused. He wants the high country, always has. The grazing up here is better than anything in the valley. And your claim is clear? My claim is clear. His voice had a flatness to it that she was learning meant controlled anger. My deed is filed. My improvements are documented. That doesn't always matter to a man like Vane if he decides he wants something badly enough. She thought about this. What does he do? When he wants something. Rhett looked at her. Whatever is necessary, he said, and some things that aren't. She nodded slowly. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain with that old, indifferent sound, and the fire snapped, and somewhere out past the walls of this solid, imperfect, not pretty cabin, a man named Silas Vane was making calculations. Mabel Cross, not Hale, never Hale, just Cross, the name she'd been born with and the name she intended to keep, sat across from Rhett Boone and thought about what she'd already done in the past 2 months. She thought about blister-wrapped hands and fence posts pulled from frozen ground and mornings she was proud of. She thought, whatever comes, I'm not running. She didn't say it out loud because Rhett Boone wasn't a man who needed things said out loud to understand them. She could see from the way he was looking at her that he'd already arrived at the same place. Outside, the wind kept coming. The mountain didn't care. But inside the cabin, something was settling. Not into comfort exactly, nothing so easy as that, but into something harder and more durable. The particular certainty of two people who have looked at the thing coming toward them and decided not to flinch. That was she was beginning to understand. The only way anything worth keeping was ever built. Pruitt's words didn't leave the cabin when he did. They stayed the way bad news tends to stay. Not loudly, not dramatically, but present in the spaces between other things, sitting in the corner of every ordinary moment like a stone you keep stepping around. Rhett didn't talk about Silas Vane again that night, and Mabel didn't push. She was learning the rhythms of him, the way a person learns the particular sounds of a house they've just moved into, which creaks mean something, which are just the structure settling. Rhett went quiet when he was thinking hard, and pushing him through that quiet produced nothing useful, so she let it alone and did her own thinking instead. What she thought was, they'd been here 2 months and she hadn't once thought about Curtis Hale. Not with longing, anyway. Not with the particular ache she'd expected to carry up the mountain with her. She thought about him the way you think about a road you didn't take, not wondering what's down it so much as simply noting that you didn't go that way. She thought that probably said something about what she'd actually felt for him versus what she'd needed him to represent, and she filed that away without spending too much time on it. December arrived, and the cold became something you didn't think about outmaneuvering. You just incorporated it into every decision of the day. She woke earlier because more things needed doing before the light gave out. She learned to dress in layers she could add or remove without stopping work, a skill that sounds minor until you've lost the feeling in 3 fingers because you were too proud to put your second pair of gloves on. Rhett showed her how to wrap her feet before her boots, a trick that seemed counterintuitive and turned out to make the kind of difference that stays with you. They developed, without discussing it, a division of labor that suited both of them. She ran the cabin, the cooking, the preserves, the mending, the small repairs that accumulated in a structure exposed to mountain winters. He ran the exterior, the livestock, the fences, the firewood, the endless vigilance of a man responsible for keeping things alive in territory that was not particularly interested in cooperating. But those categories were porous, and she found herself moving outside them more and more, not because Rhett asked, but because work needed doing, and she was there. The first time she helped him pull a calf, an event that was not graceful for anyone involved, not the cow, not the calf, not Mabel elbow deep in a situation she had not anticipated when she packed her trunk. Rhett looked at her afterward with an expression she was beginning to understand was his version of impressed. Most people, he said, in that careful way of his, would have stood back. Most people weren't here, she said. I was. He handed her a rag. She cleaned herself up, and they both pretended not to notice that her hands were shaking slightly, from effort or cold or the sheer animal enormity of what had just happened. The calf made it. They called it nothing because Rhett didn't name animals he might have to eat, a policy she found practical and slightly sad. But the rhythms of a quiet life have a way of masking things that are moving underneath them. And what was moving underneath was the slow, deliberate pressure of Silas Vane. The sign started small. In January, 3 of Rhett's fence posts along the northern boundary had been pulled and left on their sides in the snow. Not fallen, not weather damage, pulled, the difference obvious to anyone who knew what pulled versus fallen looked like. Rhett walked that fence line twice, studying the ground, and came back to the cabin with a set to his jaw that she'd not seen on him before. Someone was up here, he said. When? Night before last, probably. Ground was still soft under the snow when they came through. Why the northern boundary? He pulled off his coat and hung it. Because the northern boundary is what connects my pasture to the high grazing land above. If that boundary shifts south, he stopped, seemed to decide how much to explain. There are older claims on file for some of the territory above us. Claims that could be argued by someone with the right lawyer to include land I've been using for 6 years. She thought about this carefully. Vane's testing the edges. That's how he works, from what I hear. You push at the corners, see where things give. By the time a man realizes his whole foundation is being undermined, half the structure's already loose. Has he approached you directly? Not yet. Rhett sat down at the table. He looked tired in a way that was not physical. A bone-level tiredness that came from having something he'd built threatened by someone he couldn't see clearly yet. That's the thing about men like Vane. They don't come at you straight. They send men to stand near your property at night, and they file paperwork with territorial offices 300 miles away, and they let the pressure accumulate until you feel it from every direction and can't point to any single source. Mabel sat across from him. She thought about the supply rider Pruitt and his careful way of delivering information. Pruitt said Vane's been buying claims on the eastern side. Buying, or making people want to sell. What's the difference? Rhett met her eyes. How much pressure, he said, it takes to get the signature. She was quiet for a moment. We need to know what he's actually filed, what claims he's made, what lawyers he's using, what the territorial records show. The territorial office is in Haverfield. Haverfield's 2 days' ride. In summer, he said. In January, it's more. Then we write a letter, she said, and we find out what we're actually dealing with before we decide what to do about it. He looked at her in a way she couldn't entirely read. You've thought about this before. I've been thinking about it since Pruitt came, she said. You didn't ask, so I didn't say. But if you want to know what I think, I want to know what you think, he said simply, and she believed him, so she told him. She laid it out the way she'd worked through it. What information they needed, what information they likely already had, what their vulnerabilities were, and where their position was actually strong. She'd grown up in a settlement, which meant she'd grown up watching people navigate disputes over land and water and grazing rights, watching which approaches worked and which ones didn't. And the thing she'd observed most consistently was that the people who lost were the people who waited to understand the situation until they were already losing it. Rhett listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was how he always listened, completely, with the kind of attention that is itself a form of respect. The deed, she said. We have the original deed? Locked box under the floorboard. Good. We need copies. We need witnesses who've seen us working this land. We need... She stopped. Do you trust anyone in Coldwater Crossing? Anyone who'd testify to the improvements you've made up here? He was quiet for a moment. Gruber, he said, the justice of the peace. He's a fool about most things, but he's not Vane's man. And there's a rancher named Deakins on the South Valley who's had his own troubles with Vane's operation crowding his eastern water rights. Deakins might have information worth having, Mabel said, and he might be interested in the fact that someone else is fighting the same fight. Rhett was watching her with that unreadable expression again. She'd gotten better at reading it. It wasn't unreadable, exactly. It was just slow, like reading in a language where you have to work out each word individually before the sentence reveals itself. What it said now was something between surprise and something warmer that he hadn't named, and she wasn't going to name for him. You're good at this, he said. I'm good at paying attention, she said. I've had a lot of practice. He nodded, once. All right, he said. We write to Haverfield. The letter went with Pruitt on his next run in February, and the response came back 6 weeks later. 6 weeks during which the sabotage continued in small, infuriating ways. A water trough that someone had put a slow crack in, so it drained overnight. Tracks in the snow near the barn, always at night, never resulting in anything they could directly confront. Once, missing chickens. 4 of them, not taken by a predator because there were no predator tracks, just boot prints leading to the fence line, and then nothing. Rhett started sleeping lighter. She could tell because she slept lighter too, and sometimes they were both awake at the same hour of the night, listening to the mountain, and neither of them said anything about it in the morning. The letter from Haverfield was not good news, but it was specific news, and specific was better than the fog of what they'd been dealing with. A land attorney named Creel, operating under the umbrella of something called the Dunmore Land Company, had filed 3 applications in the past year for adjacent territory, each one incrementally closer to Rhett's recorded boundary. The applications cited a surveying discrepancy from the original territorial partition, claiming that certain stakes had been placed incorrectly, and that the correction of that error would shift the boundary lines in question. Rhett read it twice. His face did not change, but his hands tightened on the paper. They're saying my deed is wrong, he said. They're saying the survey is wrong, Mabel said. That's a different argument. It means they can't directly challenge your deed. What they're doing is trying to challenge the underlying survey that established the boundary your deed is drawn from. Is there a difference in practice? In practice, maybe not. In law, she stopped. We need our own surveyor. We need an independent survey done before theirs becomes the record. That takes money. I know. Mabel, he set down the letter. I'm not a wealthy man. I've built this place on work and time, and there isn't... I have some money, she said. He went still. No. Rhett. No, he said, and there was something in that syllable that was very old and very fixed. The particular stubbornness of a man who has built everything himself and for whom accepting something he didn't earn is tangled up with something he can't entirely explain. I'm not taking money from you. She looked at him for a long moment. Can I ask you something? You're going to ask it anyway. If I were a ranch hand, she said, and I'd been working this land since October, and I had money to contribute toward a legal defense that protects this property, would you have the same objection? He was quiet. Because I am a ranch hand, she said, and I have been working this land, and this property is mine too, by whatever arrangement we made when we left Coldwater Crossing. So the question of whether you take money from someone who is invested in this outcome is actually a question about whether you consider me part of this or not. The silence went longer this time. She could see him working through it, and she appreciated that he was actually working through it rather than just retreating into the refusal. It's not a charity arrangement, he said finally. It came out almost like a question. It's a practical arrangement, she said, which is what you offered me, back in that meeting hall. I'm offering the same thing back. He picked up the letter again. He didn't say anything else, but she understood that meant yes, and she understood what it cost him, and she didn't make anything of it. Getting an independent surveyor to the high country in late winter was not a simple problem, and solving it required Mabel to do something she'd been avoiding, which was go back to Coldwater Crossing. She didn't discuss the avoidance with Rhett. She didn't need to. She went on a Thursday because Pruitt made his run on Thursdays, and she could ride with him at least as far as the lower road, and she arrived in the settlement in the early afternoon to find that Coldwater Crossing looked exactly the same, and yet somehow smaller, which she'd been told happened but hadn't believed until now. She went to Gruber's office first. Gruber looked up when she came in and had the good grace to look uncomfortable, which she credited him for. He'd been a witness to her humiliation. He'd been standing at the front of that hall with his enormous eyebrows when Curtis Hale walked out, and he knew it, and she knew it. Mrs. Boone, he said. Miss Cross, she said, I kept my name. He blinked. Of course. Miss Cross, what can I need to know who does your surveying work, she said. Territorial level surveying. And I need to know if there's a lawyer in Haverfield who isn't already in Silas Vane's pocket. Gruber sat back. His eyebrows conducted a brief but serious conversation. You know about Vane's filings. I know about Vane's filings. He was quiet for a moment. How's Rhett? Working, she said. Like always. Except now he's working while someone undermines his fence posts at night, so he's working with less sleep. Miss Cross. Gruber leaned forward. Silas Vane is not a man who... I'm not asking for your assessment of Silas Vane, she said. I'm asking for a surveyor and a lawyer. She hadn't meant to be hard with him. The hardness just came out, and she let it stay because softening it now would cost her something she needed for other things. Gruber gave her both names, a surveyor named Aldous Peck, who operated out of the North Valley and had a reputation for accuracy and indifference to who was paying him, and a lawyer in Haverfield named Miriam Webb, who, according to Gruber, had gone up against Dunmore Land Company filings before and was still practicing, which said something. She also, before she left Coldwater Crossing, ran into Curtis Hale. She didn't go looking for him. She was coming out of the general store and he was on the steps of the hardware opposite, and they saw each other at the same moment, and there was about 3 seconds where she had to decide very quickly what she was going to do with her face. She decided on nothing, just her face, as it was. He crossed the road. That surprised her. Mabel, he said. Curtis? He looked older somehow, in 3 months. Not physically older, but weighted in the eyes, the way people look when they've had to live with something. I heard that things are going well, up at the Boone place. Things are going, she said. Well enough. I wanted to. He stopped, started again. I should have said this already. I should have come up there, but I. Another stop. He looked at his hands. What I did was wrong, the way I did it, in front of. I was a coward. She looked at him. She waited to feel something. Vindication, or anger, or the satisfaction of an apology arriving. She felt mostly tired. Not a bad tired, just the tired of someone who has been working hard and had other things on her mind. Yes, she said. You were. I'm sorry. All right, she said. He seemed to expect more from her, and she understood that the apology had in some part been for his own benefit, to give himself something to feel better about, which was human and not particularly admirable, and very much what she'd come to expect from him. She didn't give him more. She said goodbye and walked to where Pruitt was loading his wagon, and she climbed up without looking back. On the ride up the mountain, she thought not about Curtis Hale, but about Miriam Webb in Haverfield and Aldous Peck in the North Valley. And she thought about the spring that was coming eventually, even if it didn't feel like it. And she thought about what Rhett had said. It gets easier and it stays hard. And she thought that she was beginning to understand, in a way she hadn't in October, what that actually meant. Not that things got better, not that the work got lighter, or the threats got smaller, or the world started treating you the way you deserved. It meant that you got better at carrying it. You got stronger in the places that had been soft. And you found that strength was not the absence of fear or exhaustion, but something that ran underneath those things and held. The cabin was lit when she came up the track in the early dark, one orange square of window against the vast black of the mountain. Rhett came out when he heard the wagon, because he always heard things before they were visible, and she climbed down and he took her bag without making a conversation of it. Gruber had names, she said. Good names? We'll see. He nodded. They went inside. The fire was going and something was on the stove that smelled like he'd attempted cooking, which meant she'd been gone longer than he was comfortable managing alone, and she let that sit without saying anything about it. She sat at the table. He sat across from her. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain with that old sound, and the cabin held against it the way it always held. Not perfectly. A draft along the north window where they'd stuffed rags that needed replacing, the roof ticking in the cold, but held. Peck can come in March, she said, if the weather cooperates. And if it doesn't? Then April, she said. But we'll get the survey done. We'll get the record corrected, and then we'll see what Silas Vane does when the easy angle is gone. Rhett was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. He won't stop, he said. Men like that don't stop because one approach doesn't work. I know, she said, but one approach at a time. He looked at her then, and in the firelight his face had the particular quality of something she was still learning the name for. Not soft, exactly. Not the kind of thing he'd probably let her call warmth, but something underneath the stonework of him that was real and present and directed at her. She felt it the way you feel a change in temperature, the kind that happens slowly and then all at once. You did well, he said, today. I argued with the justice of the peace and bought surveying services on credit, she said. I don't know if that's doing well or just doing what needed doing. Sometimes that's the same thing, he said. She considered that. Sometimes, she agreed. The draft came in along the north window, cold and familiar. She made a note to replace those rags tomorrow. The fire held. The mountain held its silence outside. And Mabel Cross sat across from Rhett Boone in the cabin they'd spent 3 months making livable and thought that whatever was coming, and something was coming, she could feel it the way you feel a north wind before it arrives. She was not in it alone. That was not nothing. In her experience, that was very nearly everything. Aldous Peck arrived in the 3rd week of March, when the snow had pulled back just enough to make the upper track passable, but not enough to make anyone comfortable about it. He was a small, precise man who carried his surveying equipment in a wooden case he treated with more care than most people treat their children, and he had the particular manner of someone who has spent so many years measuring the world exactly that he's lost patience for everything approximate. He shook Rhett's hand, nodded at Mabel, and asked to see the original deed before he'd done anything else. Rhett got it from the locked box under the floorboard. Peck read it twice, held it toward the window light, read one section a third time, and then set it on the table with the careful flatness of a man placing something important. "The original survey stakes," he said. "You know where they are?" "3 of them," Rhett said. "The 4th, northeast corner. I've never been able to locate. Assumed it was lost. Tree fall, maybe, or frost heave." Peck made a note. "That's the one they'll argue," he said. "That's always the one they argue." He spent 2 days walking the property with Rhett, taking measurements Mabel didn't fully understand but watched carefully anyway, making notes in a small book with a pencil he sharpened 4 times a day, whether it needed it or not. On the second evening, he came in for supper and sat at the table with his notes spread around him, and she fed him salt pork and cornbread, and he ate without seeming to notice what he was eating, which she'd learned was a reliable sign that a person's mind was working hard on something else. "The northeast corner," he said finally, not looking up from his notes. "What about it?" Rhett said. "I found it." Rhett went still. "Where?" "Someone moved it," Peck said. He said it the way he said everything, flat, precise, without drama, which somehow made it worse. "The original stake is gone, but there's a placement of stones about 40 yards south of where the stake should be, and those stones didn't get there by accident." He looked up. "If someone were to argue that those stones represent the original boundary marker, your northeast corner moves, and with it, roughly 60 acres of your upper pasture." The silence in the cabin had a particular quality to it. "When?" Mabel said. "Can't say exactly. Sometime this winter, based on how the ground settled around them, after the first hard freeze." Mabel looked at Rhett. He was looking at the table with that controlled anger expression she knew well by now, the one that didn't move much on the surface but showed itself in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands. "Can you document the correct position?" she asked Peck. "That's what I'm here to do," he said. "I'll establish the correct northeast corner based on the 3 existing stakes and the deed measurements. I'll file a certified survey with the territorial office. It won't be easy to argue against once it's in the record." He paused. "It won't be impossible either, if they have the right lawyer and enough time, but it raises the cost of the argument considerably." "Do it," Rhett said. Peck spent another day completing his measurements, placed a new iron stake at the northeast corner with a thoroughness that suggested he wanted it to be there permanently, and left on the 4th morning with a check that Mabel had partially funded and Rhett had stopped arguing about. The check cost more than they could easily afford. They didn't discuss that either. What they did discuss, the evening after Peck left, was what came next. "Vane knows we know," Mabel said. "He moved that stake before we could get a survey done. When Peck's filing reaches Haverfield, Vane's attorney will see it within a week. And then he stops the subtle approach," Rhett said. "That's what I'd expect." "Good." There was something in his voice that was not exactly welcome, but was decided. The sound of a man who has been maneuvered against for months and has reached the limit of his patience with the indirect. "I'd rather know where the fight is." She understood that. She shared it to a degree. But she also knew that knowing where the fight was and being ready for it were different problems, and the second one was the one that kept her awake. What she hadn't told Rhett yet, what she'd been working out over the past weeks, was what she'd found in the bundle of papers that had come back with Peck's initial report from Haverfield. Miriam Webb, the attorney Gruber had named, had been thorough. Along with her assessment of the legal landscape, she'd included copies of the Dunmore Land Company's recent filings across the territory, and reading through them over 3 evenings by lamplight, Mabel had begun to see a pattern that made the situation both more alarming and potentially more useful. It wasn't just Rhett's land. It was never just Rhett's land. Dunmore had filed boundary disputes or purchase agreements, some obviously voluntary, some less obviously, against 11 separate properties in the Greyvale Range and the valleys below it over the past 2 years. 6 of those properties had already changed hands. The remaining 5, including Rhett's, were in various stages of pressure. 3 of those 5 owners were people Rhett knew. One of them was Deakins, the South Valley rancher he'd mentioned back in November. She told him about it on a Sunday evening, laying the papers on the table the way Peck had laid the deed, with the same deliberate flatness that came from wanting a person to understand the weight of what they were looking at. Rhett read for a long time. Deacons, he said. He's still holding, but there's a filing against his East Water rights that's been sitting in the territorial office since August. He doesn't know about this. It wasn't a question. He might not know the full scope, she said. He knows his own situation. He might not know it's connected to the same company. Rhett set down the papers. He looked at the wall for a moment in the way she'd learned meant he was making a decision, not deliberating about whether to make one, but determining the form it would take. We need to talk to Deacons, he said. And the others, she said. If there are 5 of us with active disputes against the same company, that's a different kind of legal argument than 5 separate disputes. Webb's letter suggests that coordinated filings from multiple affected parties would draw territorial-level attention that individual cases don't. You've been planning this for a while, he said. I've been thinking about it, she said. Planning requires knowing if you'll say yes. He looked at her. When do I ever say no to a sensible plan? You said no to my money. That was different. How? He opened his mouth and closed it again, and she saw the thing she'd learned to look for. That slight movement at the corner of his mouth that was as close as he generally got to a smile when he wasn't expecting to be caught at it. It was different, he said, because it was your money. This is your plan. That's not the same category. She thought about arguing the logic of that and decided it wasn't worth the time. I'll write to Deacons, she said. April came hard. The mountain didn't ease into spring the way the valley did. Up here, winter held its position until it simply wasn't there anymore, and in the space between, the thaw made everything unpredictable. The track turned to mud that could swallow a wagon wheel to the axle. The creek that fed the north pasture rose 4 feet in 2 weeks and came within 6 inches of the fence before it leveled off. A section of the barn roof, weakened by snow load all winter, came down on a Wednesday afternoon with a sound like a gunshot, and Rhett was in the barn when it happened. She heard it from the cabin. She was outside before she'd made a conscious decision to move, crossing the yard at a pace that was not quite running because running implied panic, and she refused panic, but close, and she came through the barn door to find Rhett standing in the middle of the debris, looking somewhat stunned and entirely unhurt, which was the second thing she noticed. The first thing she noticed was that her heart was conducting itself at a volume she would not have predicted. I'm fine, he said. I can see that, she said. Her voice was steady. She was not sure how. The rafter came down on the left side. He looked up at the hole in the roof. I was on the right. Lucky. I heard it start to go, he said. There's a sound, a kind of... He made a gesture that was not quite adequate to describe whatever sound he meant. You learn it. She looked at the hole in the roof. She looked at him. She made herself breathe at a normal rate. I'll get the ladder, she said. They spent the rest of the day patching the roof with boards from the lumber stack and tar paper that Rhett had the foresight to keep in supply, because this was not the first roof emergency and would not be the last. She was on the roof with him, which was not comfortable. The pitch was steep, and the wind at elevation had opinions. And they worked in the companionable silence that had become their normal register, handing things to each other without asking, anticipating where the next nail needed to go. At some point in the late afternoon, sitting on the roof ridge with the territory spread out below them going gold in the westering light, Rhett said without particular preamble, I'm glad you're here. She looked at him. He was looking out at the view, not at her. Here specifically, she said, or here in the general sense of the arrangement. Both, he said, still not looking at her. Either. A pause. I've been alone up here a long time, and I told myself it suited me. I think I was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her hair. Below them, the mountain dropped away in its enormous impartial way, and the light kept going gold, and she thought about all the versions of her life that hadn't led here, all the different turnings, and felt something that was not quite gratitude because that word was too small and pointed in the wrong direction. You're not easy company, she said. I know. You don't say things when you should. You assume I understand things you haven't explained, and sometimes I don't. You put the coffee on too strong every single morning, and when I've made it differently, you haven't said anything, but I can tell you think it's wrong. He was quiet for a moment. The coffee I make is too strong, she said. It wakes you up. Everything about this mountain wakes you up." Another pause, and then he turned to look at her, and she looked back. And his face in the late light had that quality she still didn't have a precise name for, the thing that lived underneath the stonework and came out in these sideways moments. She thought maybe the name for it was simply him, just the specific texture of Rhett Boone being present with her, which was its own category. "The coffee stays," he said. "The coffee stays," she agreed. It wasn't a declaration of anything. It wasn't the kind of moment that gets made into a story. But it was real, and it was theirs, and she held on to it. Well, Deacons came up the mountain on a Thursday in late April. A barrel-shaped man in his late 50s who had the look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and had arrived at a truce with the elements that he held on to through sheer stubbornness. He shook Mabel's hand with the straightforwardness of a person who doesn't modify their behavior based on what they're expecting from someone, which she liked immediately. He sat at the table with the papers spread out in front of him, and he read the way Rhett read, completely, without comment, taking his time. When he finished, he sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. "Son of a—" He stopped, looked at Mabel. "Sorry." "Say what you need to say," she said. "Son of a dog," he said, which was not what he'd been going to say, and she appreciated the effort. "All 11 properties, same company." "Same attorney filing," Mabel said. "The applications have different stated grounds, different technical arguments, but the underlying legal structure is identical. Webb thinks they were drafted by the same person or office." "Webb's the Haverfield lawyer?" "She's the one I'd recommend." Deacons looked at Rhett. "Your wife put this together?" "She did," Rhett said. "Huh." Deacons looked at her again, with the particular quality of someone recalibrating an assumption. "I heard about you. From town." "I'm sure you did," she said evenly. "I heard you were—" He seemed to decide something. "People said things. About you. Seems like people were wrong." "People often are," she said. "That's not what's important right now. What's important is whether you'd be willing to approach the other affected landowners. You know 2 of them better than we do." "Harmon and Pike," Deacon said. "Yeah, Harmon's been thinking about selling anyway, but I don't think he knows what he's actually dealing with. And Pike's stubborn as rock, he'd fight to the last dollar." He looked at the papers again. "You think territorial authorities would actually act on a coordinated complaint?" "Webb thinks there's a fraud argument," Mabel said. "If Dunmore has been systematically misrepresenting survey data and filing false boundary claims across multiple properties, that's not a civil land dispute. That's a criminal matter." The word criminal landed in the room with some weight. Deacons let it settle. "Vane's got people," he said, "in Haverfield. Maybe in the territorial office. I don't know how deep it goes." "We don't either," Mabel said. "But Webb does. She's been watching his operation for 2 years. She has documentation we don't." "It's a risk," Deacon said. "You go after a man like that and miss. He comes back twice as hard." "He's already coming," Rhett said. It was the first thing he'd said since Deacons arrived, and he said it quietly, without emphasis, the way he said things that didn't need emphasis. "He moved a boundary stake on my property this winter. He's been running men along my fence line for months. Not moving now doesn't mean it stops." Deacons was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table. Then he nodded, once the way people nod when they've made a decision that's going to cost them something and have decided it's worth it anyway. "I'll talk to Harmon and Pike," he said. "Give me 2 weeks." He didn't need 2 weeks. Harmon came back with him in 10 days, a thin, nervous man who'd been sitting on a powder keg without knowing exactly what kind. Pike, predictably, didn't need convincing so much as confirmation. He'd known something was wrong and had been furious about it in the unspecified way of someone who can feel the shape of a problem but not see its edges. Seeing the edges made him angrier and more focused, which was better. They met at Rhett's cabin on a Thursday evening, 5 people around a table meant for 2, eating Mabel's biscuits and looking at papers she'd organized into a form Webb could work from. She walked them through it methodically, the same way she'd walked through everything since October. One thing at a time, no faster than the problem required, no slower. She was in the middle of explaining the coordinated filing structure when she looked up and caught Rhett watching her from across the table. Not the papers. Her. with the expression she'd spent months learning to read and could now, finally, name without hesitation. It was the way you look at something you're proud of. Not the pride that comes from making something, but the kind that comes from being adjacent to it, from having had the sense to see it clearly when everyone else was looking somewhere else. She looked back at the papers. Her face felt warm, which she attributed to the fire. Deakins asked a question about the filing timeline. She answered it. The meeting went another hour. By the end, they had the shape of a coordinated complaint, 4 properties and 5 landowners presenting a unified challenge to Dunmore's survey filings across the territory. It was not a sure thing. She knew it wasn't a sure thing. Webb had been careful to say so, and Mabel was constitutionally allergic to false comfort, had been since she was a girl, and had learned that hoping for something smooth usually just delayed the moment of impact. But it was something. It was concrete and documented, and it had names attached to it and a lawyer willing to put her own reputation behind it, and that was more than they'd had in January when this felt like a problem that was going to outlast them. After Harmon and Pike left, and Deakins had settled for the night in the barn rather than ride the track in the dark, Rhett banked the fire while Mabel stacked the papers. The cabin was quiet in the way it got late at night, the mountain quiet rather than the valley quiet, larger and somehow more specific, like silence that means something. Webb thinks she can file in 6 weeks, Mabel said. If we have everything she needs. We'll have it, Rhett said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and she could see what she'd seen on the roof, that he was in this all the way in, not because someone was threatening what he'd built, but because he'd stopped thinking of it as purely his and started thinking of it as something shared, something worth defending in a different way than it had been before. Then Pruitt's horse came up the track at a speed that was not Pruitt's normal speed, and both of them heard it at the same time and were at the door before he'd fully stopped. He didn't get down from the horse. That was the first thing she noticed. Vane's men were seen at the south fence line, he said, breathing hard. 6 of them, armed. He looked between the 2 of them. That was 3 hours ago. By now they could be... The shot came from somewhere outside before he finished the sentence. Not close, maybe a quarter mile, but it hit the air with enough force that all 3 of them went still. Then Rhett reached back into the cabin and took the rifle from above the door, and Mabel went for the knife on her belt and the second rifle on the wall without being asked, and Deakins came out of the barn at a run, and the night outside was very dark and very large, and somewhere in it, Silas Vane had finally stopped being subtle. The shot had come from the south, which meant they'd come up the lower track rather than through the timber, faster, but it also meant they wanted to be heard. That was the thing Mabel turned over in her mind as Rhett moved to the corner of the cabin, and she took the opposite wall, pressing her back against the logs with the rifle across her chest. A warning shot, or a positioning shot. Either way, someone out in the dark had wanted them to know they were there. That was a choice, and choices told you things. "How many did you say?" Rhett asked Pruitt, his voice low. Pruitt had gotten off the horse and was pressed against the barn wall, which was sensible. 6 that were seen, could be more. They were at the south fence 2 hours before I spotted them, so they've had time to spread. Deakins had come out of the barn with his own rifle and was crouched at the far corner, covering the east approach. He caught Mabel's eye across the yard, and she gave a small nod, which he returned. She'd noticed before that Deakins was a man who didn't need things explained twice, which she considered one of his better qualities. "They're not shooting at us yet," she said to Rhett. "No. That means they want something before they do." "They want us to run," he said. "Leave the property on our own so the fight's simpler." She thought about that. 6 men, armed, positioned around the property in the dark. The cabin behind her solid and defensible. The barn to the east. The timber to the north, which ran steep up the mountain, and which she knew better than anyone except Rhett, because she'd walked it all through the winter. To the south, the track they'd come up. "Pruitt," she said quietly, "can you get back down the track?" "Not on horseback. They'll hear me before I'm past the first bend." "On foot?" A pause. "Maybe." "We need someone in Coldwater Crossing by morning," she said. "We need Gruber and anyone with a badge within 50 miles to know that Silas Vane's men are on private property under arms." Rhett looked at her. "That's a long walk in the dark." "I know what it is," she said. Pruitt, can you do it? Pruitt considered this with the expression of a man taking honest inventory of himself. I've walked worse, he said finally. Give me 20 minutes to get to the timberline, and I'm out of their sight the whole way down. Go along the north fence, Mabel said. There's a deer track about 40 yards in. It runs parallel to the main trail, but it's inside the tree line. Rhett showed it to me in November. Pruitt looked at Rhett. Rhett nodded. 20 minutes, Pruitt said, and moved. They watched him go in silence, slipping along the cabin wall and into the shadow of the tree line, and then he was gone and the night settled back around them with that enormous mountain quiet that now had something coiled inside it. Nothing happened for a while. That was almost worse. She could hear Rhett breathing, controlled and even, and she matched her own breathing to it without thinking about it, the way you unconsciously match pace with someone you've been walking beside for a long time. She was cold. She was aware of being cold and didn't do anything about it because there was nothing to do. And she noted that she was not afraid in the way she'd expected. There was something in her chest that was alert and very awake, but it was not the paralysis kind. It was the kind that makes everything sharp. About 40 minutes after Pruitt disappeared, a voice came out of the dark from the south. Boone. Not loud, carried enough to reach. We're not here for trouble. Rhett said nothing. Mr. Vane has a business proposition. You come out and we talk. Nobody needs to spend a cold night on this mountain. Still nothing from Rhett. Mabel moved along the cabin wall until she was close enough to speak near his ear. They're trying to get you outside. I know. Don't. I know, he said again, and his voice had that flat quality that meant he'd already made the decision and wasn't going to revisit it. The voice from the south tried again, and this time there was less friendly in it. Boone, you've got people on your property and legal trouble coming from 3 directions. Mr. Vane is willing to make you whole on the sale price. That's a better offer than you'll see from a court. Mabel put her mouth close to the wall and raised her voice just enough to carry. This is private property, she called out. You're trespassing under arms. Every man with you is looking at territorial charges. A pause from the dark. She'd evidently surprised them, which she'd expected. They'd planned for Rhett's silence, not for another voice. Ma'am, I'm not finished, she said. We have documentation of every fraudulent survey filing Dunmore Land Company has made in this territory over the past 2 years. We have a coordinated complaint prepared for the territorial authority with 5 landowners attached to it. We have an attorney in Haverfield who has been building this case since before you came up this mountain tonight. She paused. Whatever Vane told you this night would accomplish, he was wrong. Longer silence this time. Then a different voice, further back, that she didn't recognize, said something she couldn't make out. And then nothing. The night sat on them. Rhett turned his head toward her slightly, which was his version of looking at her fully. You just told them what we have. I told them what they'd lose, she said. That's different. They're hired men, not believers. The calculation changes when the risk goes up. And if it doesn't change? Then we're in the same position we were in before I said it, she said. Nothing lost. He was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about that since they got here. Since Pruitt came through the gate, she admitted. She heard something shift in the darkness, movement, more than one person. Then a horse, and another. She tracked the sounds, south, moving east, then further away. She counted sounds the way Rhett had taught her to count sounds, letting them tell her what was moving and where. Her heart was going fast. She didn't let it change anything. They're pulling back, Deacons called from the east corner, low. Don't move yet, Rhett said. They waited another 20 minutes in the cold dark before Rhett crossed the yard to Deacons, and they did a circuit of the property perimeter while Mabel kept the cabin door covered. It took half an hour. They came back with nothing. No one at the fence lines, no horses in the timber, boot prints in the mud at the south gate and along the east fence that confirmed where the men had positioned themselves, and then the tracks leaving south down the main track. She let herself breathe. Not completely. She wasn't naive enough to think that 6 men withdrawing at midnight meant this was over, because it was nowhere close to over. But for tonight, the immediate thing had passed. She went inside and put the coffee on, because that was what needed doing next. Gruber arrived at midday the following day with a territorial deputy named Marsh, who had the demeanor of a man who'd ridden through the night and had no patience left for anything that wasn't directly relevant. Pruitt had made it to Coldwater Crossing by dawn and apparently been very persuasive, which she hadn't doubted. Marsh walked the property with Rhett for 2 hours, looking at the boot prints, the fence tampering from Winter, the move stake that Peck had documented. He wrote things in a notebook with the same dedicated precision as Peck, though for different purposes. At the table afterward, he spread his notebook open and looked at Mabel and Rhett with a directness that was neutral rather than friendly. What you've described and what I've seen on this property is consistent with criminal intimidation and trespass, he said. The survey tampering, if it can be documented, it's documented, Mabel said. I have the surveyor's certified report, and I have documentation of 11 Dunmore Land Company filings across the territory, including 4 properties whose owners are willing to file a coordinated complaint. Marsh looked at her for a moment. You prepared all of this? Yes. Are you a lawyer? No, she said. I'm paying attention. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but an adjustment, the look of someone recalibrating upward. The coordinated complaint, he said. That would need to go to the territorial prosecutor, not a civil court. Do you have an attorney? Miriam Webb. Haverfield. I know Webb, he said, and from the way he said it, she understood that he knew her favorably. If she's prepared to file, that carries weight. She's prepared, Mabel said. We've been corresponding for 2 months. She's waiting on our final documentation. Which you have. Which I have. Marsh closed the notebook. He looked at Rhett. Mr. Boone, your wife is... She's not... Rhett started. She goes by Cross, Mabel said. Mabel Cross. Marsh accepted this without comment. Miss Cross has put together a stronger case than most trained investigators would manage, he said. If what she's compiled is accurate, it's accurate, Rhett said. Then Silas Vane has a significant problem coming. He stood. What happened last night was a miscalculation on his part. Those men trespassing under arms on a documented property with witnesses, that's not smart. That's a man who thought he could finish this quickly before it became a legal matter, and he was wrong. He looked at Mabel. He's going to be angry. I know, she said. He might try again. I know that too. Are you prepared? She thought about a winter of fence posts and barn roofs and frozen ground. She thought about Pruitt walking down a mountain in the dark, and Deakins at the east corner with his rifle and pike, who'd been furious and focused, and 4 landowners sitting around a table eating her biscuits. She thought about Rhett on the roof ridge saying, I'm glad you're here without looking at her, the way he said real things. Yes, she said. Bam. The next 3 weeks were not peaceful, but they were a different kind of hard. The heart of paperwork and letters and coordinating 5 parties across a territory rather than the heart of standing in a dark yard listening for movement. Webb filed the coordinated complaint on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the territorial prosecutor's office had sent an acknowledgement that indicated, in the careful language of official correspondence, that the matter was being taken seriously. By the following week, Dunmore Land Company's attorney Creel had been summoned to Haverfield. Mabel knew about all of this through letters that came with Pruitt, who had developed a proprietary interest in the situation and now made his mountain run 3 times a week instead of 2, arriving with the energy of someone who'd found a purpose. What she didn't know, until Deakins rode up on a Wednesday afternoon with a look on his face that was not good news, was that Silas Vane had made one more move before the walls closed in on him. He'd gone to the original deeds registry in Haverfield personally, and he'd filed a challenge, not against Rhett's boundary this time, but against the original deed itself, claiming that the land had been registered under fraudulent circumstances in the territorial partition of 12 years prior. It was, Deakins said, reading from a letter that Webb had sent ahead to him because she knew he'd get to Rhett faster than the post, a last measure from a man who was watching his other options close. But it was serious. Challenging the original deed was a longer fight and a more expensive one, and Vane had the resources to drag it out past what most of the affected landowners could sustain. Rhett read Webb's letter twice, His face was unreadable in the way it got when the thing he was dealing with was large enough that the usual expressions weren't adequate to it. "He's trying to outlast us," he said. "Yes," Mabel said. "We can't outlast him on money." "No," she said. "We can't." He set the letter down and looked at her, and she could see the thing she'd been watching happen over months. The accumulated weight of a fight he'd been in before she arrived, and the particular tiredness of a man who has built something with his hands over years and is being asked to defend it in a language and arena that isn't his. "Mabel," he said. "I know," she said. "If this goes long, I know," she said again. "Let me think." She thought for most of that night. Rhett slept, or tried to. She could tell from the sound of his breathing that it wasn't clean sleep, not the solid unconsciousness of a man at rest, but something lighter and more vigilant. She sat at the table with Webb's letter and the full file of documents she'd assembled over months, and she went through everything again, not looking for what she knew, but looking for what she'd missed. She found it around 2 in the morning. It was in the oldest papers, the ones from the original territorial partition that she'd requested copies of from Haverfield back in February and had read twice and then filed because they didn't seem immediately relevant. A survey record from 12 years prior attached to the original deed filing. And in that record, a name. The surveyor who'd certified the original partition, the same partition Vane was now claiming was fraudulent, was a man named Aldous Peck. She sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and lit the lamp and read it again to be sure. Aldous Peck had surveyed this land 12 years ago. He'd been here before. He'd certified the boundary lines that Vane was now challenging, which meant that Peck's original documentation, not just his recent survey, but his records from 12 years prior, was direct evidence against Vane's claim. If Peck had his original survey notes, and he was the kind of man who kept original survey notes because he was the kind of man who kept everything precise and documented, and in the right case with the right pencil. She got up and went to the bedroom doorway. Rhett. He was awake immediately, which told her he hadn't really been sleeping. What? Peck surveyed this land 12 years ago. Silence. He has the original survey notes, she said. If his certification of the original partition is in the record, Vane's claim that the deed was fraudulently registered falls apart. You can't claim the registration was fraudulent when the surveyor who certified it is still alive and has his notes. Rhett sat up. In the lamplight from the other room, his face had that quality of someone who's been carrying a weight and has just felt it shift, not gone, but redistributed. "Can we reach Peck?" he said. "I have his address," she said. "North Valley. I'll write tonight." "Mabel." He said her name in the way he said it sometimes, without anything attached to it, just the name itself, which she'd learned meant something he didn't have the words for in his usual inventory. "Go back to sleep," she said. "I'll write the letter." "You should sleep." "I'll sleep after," she said. "I need to write this while I know exactly what to say." She heard him settle back. She went to the table and she wrote the letter to Aldous Peck by lamplight. And then she wrote a second letter to Webb. And when she finished both, it was past 3 in the morning, and the mountain outside the window was the particular deep dark that comes just before it starts to lighten. She sat back and looked at the letters. Her handwriting was tired. She could see it in the last lines, the slight unsteadiness that came from being awake when you shouldn't be. But the letters said what they needed to say, and they were honest, and they were accurate, and that was enough. She was not going to pretend this was finished. Peck's notes were not guaranteed to be complete, and Webb still had to build the argument, and Vane still had money and lawyers and the particular persistence of a man who had not yet accepted that he was losing. There would be more to this. There was always more. But she looked at those 2 letters, and she thought about October, about standing in a meeting hall in a too-tight dress with flowers she'd picked herself. And she thought about what she'd understood in those 4 seconds before the laughter started, that the future she'd planned had just been removed, that she was standing in the wreckage of it with nowhere to go. She thought about Rhett's hand closing around hers, the steadiness of it. She put the letters together and set them where Pruitt would find them in the morning. Then she sat for a moment more in the quiet, with the lamp burning and the dark outside the window starting to lose its deepest density, the first suggestion of something not yet light, but no longer entirely dark. She thought, We're still here. That was what mattered. Whatever Silas Vane filed or threatened or sent up the mountain in the dark, they were still here, in this solid, imperfect cabin, with documentation and allies and a surveyor who kept his notes, and each other. She put out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in weeks, she slept. Aldous Peck wrote back in 8 days. His letter was exactly what she'd expected from him. Brief, precise, and more valuable than something 3 times its length. He had his original survey notes from the territorial partition. He had them in the same wooden case he'd brought up the mountain in March, the one he treated like something irreplaceable, which it turned out was exactly what it was. He'd been following the Dunmore Land Company situation with professional interest, he wrote, because a challenge to a partition survey was a challenge to his own certified work, and he did not take that lightly. He was willing to testify. Mabel read that line twice, then set the letter down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Not from relief exactly. She'd learned not to spend relief until the thing was actually resolved, because spending it early left you with nothing when the next turn came, and there was always a next turn. But from something. The particular feeling of a peace you've been looking for dropping into the right place. She sent Peck's letter to Webb the same day with a note that said simply, "He'll testify. Tell me what you need and when." Webb's response came back with Pruitt 10 days later, and it was longer and more carefully worded, because Webb was the kind of lawyer who didn't say a thing in 5 words when 12 would be more accurate. The territorial prosecutor had opened a formal investigation into Dunmore Land Company's filing practices across the region. The coordinated complaint from the 5 landowners had been received and was being treated as evidence of a pattern rather than isolated disputes. Creel, Vane's attorney, had already begun a quiet renegotiation of his position, which Webb described as the first indication that a man in an indefensible situation is beginning to understand his circumstances. She recommended they do nothing provocative, make no public statements, and let the legal process build the pressure it was building. "You have done the work," she wrote at the end. "Now we let the record speak." It was good advice, and Mabel took it, though taking it was not easy. Doing nothing when something is unresolved goes against every instinct she'd developed over the past year. She kept herself occupied with the ranch, which was not difficult because the ranch was always generating work in quantities that exceeded available time. Spring had come fully now. Real spring. Not the tentative thaw of March, but the actual greening of things. The pasture coming in. The high country shedding the last of its snow and opening up to the sky in a way that made you understand why Rhett had chosen this particular elevation above all the easier ones. She started something she'd been thinking about since January. There was a section of the lower pasture that hadn't been used for anything, running toward the south fence, flat enough and sheltered enough to be good ground. She talked to Rhett about it one evening, spreading a rough sketch on the table beside the supper dishes. "Kitchen garden here," she said. "Big enough to produce surplus, not just what we use, potatoes, turnips, squash, corn if we want it." He looked at the sketch. "That's a lot of ground to break." "I know. There's only 2 of us." "There's also Deacons," she said, "and his 2 boys who are 15 and 17 and have more energy than sense. I already asked him. He said yes in exchange for 1/3 of the first yield." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You already asked him?" "Last week, when he came by with Marcia's deposition form." He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to describe and just accepted as his particular brand of being present with her. "Was there a plan where you told me before negotiating with the neighbors?" "I'm telling you now," she said, "before we start." "That's not—" He stopped. Something moved in his face. "That's not before. That's simultaneously." "Is that a no?" He looked at the sketch again. She could see him working through it. The ground, the labor, the yield, the arrangement with Deacons. And she could see the moment he arrived at the same place she'd already arrived at, which was that it was a sensible plan, and the main thing wrong with it was that he hadn't been consulted in the expected order. "The corn," he said, "planted on the east side. Better drainage." She moved her pencil. "East side," she said. "Seppo." The territorial hearing was held in Haverfield on a Thursday in late June, and Mabel and Rhett made the 2-day ride together, which was the first time she'd been that far from the mountain since October. Haverfield was larger than Coldwater Crossing by a significant degree. A real town, with a newspaper and a hotel and a courthouse that had glass in every window, which still struck her as slightly extravagant. Webb met them at the hotel. She was a woman in her mid-40s, direct and angular in the way of someone who has spent years in rooms where directness is an occupational necessity. She shook Mabel's hand first, which Mabel noted. "Peck's already here," Webb said. "Deakins and Pike come in this morning. Harmon's on his way." She looked at both of them. "The prosecutor has been thorough. Creel filed a motion yesterday to delay proceedings, which was denied, which tells you where the judge is on this." "What do we need to do?" Rhett asked. "Sit in that courtroom and let me do the talking," she said. "Unless you're asked a direct question and then you answer it honestly and briefly." "Mabel?" She turned. "Your documentation is going to be entered as evidence. All of it. The organized file you sent me is the clearest piece of preparatory work I've received from a non-attorney in 20 years of practice." "It wasn't complicated," Mabel said. "It just needed to be organized." "Most things do," Webb said. "Most people can't be bothered." The hearing lasted 2 days. Mabel sat in that courtroom and watched the legal machinery that she'd spent months helping to build actually run. And it was not the dramatic thing she might have expected. It was methodical and sometimes tedious and occasionally technical beyond her ability to follow, but it was moving in one direction and it kept moving in that direction, which was all she needed it to do. Peck was the moment that mattered most. He took the stand with his wooden case and opened it on the witness table and produced survey notes 12 years old in handwriting so precise it might have been typeset. And he walked the court through the original partition methodology with the particular authority of a man who has been doing one thing for 30 years and has never done it wrong. When Creel attempted to suggest that the original stakes might have been misplaced, Peck looked at him with an expression of such thorough professional offense that the courtroom went very quiet. "Young man," Peck said, and the fact that Creel was 50 years old was not relevant to Peck's register. "I have surveyed 1,100 miles of territorial boundary in my career. I have never misplaced a stake. The stake that was found 40 yards south of the recorded position was moved after my certification. The soil disturbance around it and the weathering pattern on its base are inconsistent with 12 years of ground placement. Someone moved that stake in the past year. It was not there when I planted it." The courtroom was silent. "That's all I have to say on the matter," Peck added, and folded his hands. Creel did not have further questions. Mabel watched Silas Vane during all of this from across the room. She'd expected someone larger somehow, someone whose physical presence matched the space he'd taken up in their lives for the past 7 months. He was a compact man in an expensive coat, with the controlled face of someone accustomed to rooms where he held the advantage. He watched the proceedings with a stillness that she recognized, the stillness of a man managing what he was feeling rather than not feeling it. He never looked at her directly. She noticed that. She thought it was deliberate, that he'd been told who she was and what she'd put together, and that looking at her would mean acknowledging something he'd rather not acknowledge. She didn't need him to look at her. The judge's ruling came on the second afternoon. The Dunmore Land Company's boundary challenges across all affected properties were dismissed with a finding of fraudulent survey manipulation. The company's operating licenses in the territory were suspended pending further investigation. Creel was referred to the territorial bar for review. Silas Vane was not arrested that day. The criminal component of the investigation would take longer. But he walked out of that courthouse into a territory where his name now meant something different than it had when he walked in. And the weight of that was visible in how he moved. Deakins shook Mabel's hand outside on the courthouse steps, and then seemed to think that wasn't adequate and shook it again. Pike said something in his economical way about "finally" that managed to contain 6 months of frustration in 2 syllables. Harmon looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for half a year and had just been told he could stop. Webb stood beside Mabel and watched all of this with the professional satisfaction of someone who has seen many things and allows herself to feel good about the good ones. "What happens to Vane?" Mabel asked her. "The criminal investigation will take time," Webb said. "He has resources. He'll fight it. But his land holdings in this territory are effectively frozen until the investigation concludes, and his reputation in every room that matters is finished." She paused. Men like that tend to find that the real punishment is not the legal one. It's becoming someone other men no longer return calls from. Mabel thought about that. Is that enough? Webb looked at her. Is it what you hoped for? I hoped no one would come up our mountain with guns, Mabel said. Beyond that, I tried not to hope for specific things. That's wise, Webb said. In my experience, the law is rarely as satisfying as the story you imagined. But it's real, and it holds, and it keeps holding even after you stop watching it. They rode back to the mountain over 2 days, and the riding was different from the riding down. Not easier, the road was the same road, but something in the atmosphere between them had shifted, not into something new, but into something more settled, like furniture that's been in a room long enough to look like it was always there. Rhett was quiet for most of the first day, which she understood. He was processing in the way he processed, internally and thoroughly, and interrupting it served no one. She let the road unspool and watched the territory move past and thought her own thoughts, which were not about Vane or the hearing or any of the machinery that had consumed the past months. She thought about the kitchen garden, which Deakins' boys had started breaking ground on while they were in Haverfield. She thought about the north fence section that still needed a post replaced. She thought about small, ordinary things that had no urgency and needed doing anyway, and she found that this was the most pleasant thinking she'd done in a long time. On the second afternoon, with the mountain visible ahead of them and the track beginning to climb, Rhett said, I've been thinking about the east pasture. What about it? There's room for another 10 head if we expand the upper fence line. Better grazing up there than what we've been using. He was looking at the trail ahead. It would take most of the summer to do right. That's a lot of fence. It is. She thought about this. We could ask Deacon's boys. They work for fair wages and they know what they're doing. They do, he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking we might consider taking on a hand, full time. Someone who can winter here and knows mountain work. She looked at him. This was a significant thing. Rhett, who had been solitary on this mountain for 6 years, proposing to expand the human population of his homestead beyond the two of them. She understood what it meant, not just practical expansion, a different idea of what the place was and could be. You'd need to find the right person, she said. I'd need you to find the right person, he said. You're better at reading people than I am. She thought about arguing that, and then thought about the fact that it was simply true, and arguing it would just be modesty for its own sake. I'll put out word with Pruitt, she said. He knows everyone. He does, Rhett said. They rode for a while in the good quiet. Rhett. I want to say something. He waited. That was one of the things she'd come to depend on about him. He waited. He didn't fill silence with reassurance or deflection. He just waited for what you actually meant to say. When you took my hand in that meeting hall, she said, I thought you were doing me a kindness. I thought I was taking something I didn't deserve because I was desperate enough to take it. He said nothing. I want you to know I don't think that anymore, she said. I don't think I was desperate. I think I was just ready, and I didn't know it. Ready to go somewhere that wasn't that valley, ready for something that was actually hard instead of just... She stopped. Instead of just small. You were never small, he said. I know that now. He looked over at her. The mountain was close now, the familiar shape of it against the afternoon sky, and the track was beginning its steep climb. I took your hand, he said, because you were the most composed person in that room. In a situation that would have broken most people in half, you were standing there like you were deciding something. He paused. I wanted to know what you'd decide. She looked at him for a long moment. And you decided well, he said, simply, like that was the whole of it. Maybe it was. Summer came to the mountain the way summer always came, not announcing itself, but simply arriving, the world warming by increments. Until one morning you wake up and the light is different and the air smells like growing things, and you understand that the season has changed while you were doing other things. The kitchen garden came in better than she'd projected. The east pasture fence got built over 8 weeks with Deacon's boys working 4 days a week and complaining enthusiastically about the gradient, which she paid no attention to because the complaints were the complaining of people who are working and know it. A hand named Garrett arrived in August, recommended by Pruitt and interviewed by Mabel over a 2-hour conversation that Rhett sat in on and contributed 3 questions to, which was exactly the right number. Garrett was 22 and had grown up on a mountain ranch 2 territories over and had an unhurried quality about him that suggested someone who had already made peace with the fact that work does not finish, it only continues. He slept in the barn in a corner that Rhett had partitioned off into something habitable, and he was good with the horses and asked sensible questions and did not require managing, all of which Mabel considered essential qualifications. In September, a letter came from Webb that Vane had been formally charged with land fraud and survey falsification across 7 counts. His assets in the territory had been frozen. Creel had been disbarred. The Dunmore Land Company had dissolved. Webb wrote that she expected the criminal proceedings to take another year, possibly 2, and that she would keep them informed. Mabel read the letter and put it in the file and went back to what she'd been doing, which was helping Garrett and Rhett bring in the last of the hay before the first frost. That was the thing about the ranch. It didn't stop for news, good or bad. The hay needed bringing in regardless of what was happening in Haverfield, and the horses needed feeding regardless of what a judge decided, and the north fence post that had been leaning since August needed replacing before winter, all of which were facts that had nothing to do with Silas Vane and everything to do with the actual business of living. She thought sometimes about the woman she'd been in that meeting hall, standing at the front of the room in the wrong-sized dress, listening to laughter spread through the crowd, staring at a nail on the wall with nothing hanging from it. She didn't think about that woman with the particular wincing pity that she'd expected to. She thought about her with something closer to recognition. That woman had been holding herself very still in an unbearable moment, waiting to find out if she was the kind of person who could survive it. She was finding out now. The answer was yes, but it was a complicated yes. Not the yes of someone who came through unscathed, but the yes of someone who came through changed, and found that the changes, most of them, were improvements. Not all of them. She was harder than she'd been. She trusted more slowly. She had a new tolerance for discomfort and a new intolerance for certain kinds of nonsense that she'd previously absorbed without comment. She was not easier to be around than she'd been at 26, standing in that valley hoping Curtis Hale would be the answer to the question she'd been asking. But she was more herself. Whatever self was being built up here on this mountain, in the cold and the work and the dailiness of a life that didn't ask permission before it got difficult. It was hers, in a way that nothing in the valley had ever been. Coldwater Crossing had a harvest gathering in early October, the kind of annual event that settlements hold because winter is coming and people need to look at each other before they hole up for months. They went down. Mabel almost didn't. She thought about it for a few days and concluded that she wasn't afraid of it, which meant she should go, because avoiding things you're not afraid of is just habit becoming smaller over time. They came down the mountain on a Saturday morning, Rhett and Mabel and Garrett, and the settlement looked small in the way it had looked small to her in February. Compact, a little weathered, more manageable than her childhood memory of it. People turned to look when they came through. That happened, she'd gotten used to it as something that happened, and she let it be a thing that happened without making much of it. Gruber came to her first, which surprised her until she thought about it and realized he'd been sitting with how he'd behaved in that hall for a year and probably needed somewhere to put it. "Miss Cross," he said, "I heard about Haverfield. What you put together?" "Webb put it together," she said. "I just collected things in the right order." "That's not—" He stopped. "You're being modest." "I'm being accurate," she said, not unkindly. He nodded, and she could see him decide to let it rest at that, which was the right decision. Some debts aren't paid with words. You just go forward differently, and that has to be enough. She saw Curtis Hale across the gathering later in the afternoon. He was with a woman she didn't know, recently arrived in the valley from the look of her, and he was talking to her with that same quality of measured practicality that Mabel had once mistaken for honesty. She watched for a moment and felt nothing in particular, not triumph, not residual hurt, not the complex satisfaction of visible contrast, just the neutral acknowledgement of a past that had turned out to be a door rather than a wall. She turned back to the conversation she'd been having with Deacon's wife, who was a capable woman with strong opinions about crop rotation and no interest in discussing anything else, and she found she preferred that conversation significantly. Rhett stayed near her the whole afternoon, not in a protective way, not hovering, just present in the easy way of someone who is comfortable in their own company and in hers. When people talked to her, he listened. When they talked to him, she listened. They were the same entity, and also themselves, which was, she thought, the best version of what two people could be to each other. Toward the end of the afternoon, a woman she half knew from years back, a woman who had been in that meeting hall, whose face she'd seen in the blur of the crowd, came up and said, somewhat awkwardly, "I heard what you did, with Vane and the land business. I heard it was you that figured it out." "It was a lot of people," Mabel said. "That's not what I heard." The woman looked at her with an expression that was trying to be something and hadn't quite gotten there, which Mabel recognized as the face of someone who needs to say something that costs them a little. "I was in that hall a year ago. She stopped. "I didn't say anything. When Curtis, I didn't say anything." "No," Mabel agreed. "I should have." Mabel looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to say, which was not the same as what she'd have said a year ago, and also not the saintly forgiveness she'd have been expected to perform. She thought about Webb. The law is rarely as satisfying as the story you imagined, but it's real, and it holds. "Next time," she said, "say something." The woman nodded, and that was the end of it. They rode back up the mountain in the last of the daylight, the three of them spread across the track, not talking much because the ride required attention and because the quiet up here had stopped needing to be filled. The mountain came into view around the last bend, enormous and familiar, stone and timber, and the particular hard sky above the peaks, and below it the homestead. The barn that leaned slightly east and had no plans to lean further, the cabin with the repaired north window, and the coffee that was still too strong every morning without exception. Mabel looked at all of it in the evening light and thought, this is mine. Not in the small way of possession, in the larger way of belonging to something that is also yours. The way a place gets into you when you've worked it and defended it and learned its weather and its sounds and which of its fence posts will fail before the others. She had not been given this. She had not lucked into it. She had made it, alongside Rhett, with her hands and her mind, and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been so much simpler. Rhett reined in at the gate and looked at her, looking at the homestead. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He looked too for a moment at the place that was his and had always been his, but had become something different in the past year, bigger somehow for being shared. "The roof on the barn," he said. "We'll need to check it before snow." "I know," she said. "And the east pasture fence, upper section?" "I know," she said. "Tomorrow." He nodded. They went through the gate and up to the cabin, and Garrett took the horses, and the evening opened into the ordinary work of it. The fire, the supper, the small repair to the window latch that she'd been putting off, the lamp lit against the dark that came down fast in October. There was nothing resolved about life. She understood that more clearly now than she ever had. Vane's trial would go on for another year, maybe two, and the east fence would need maintenance every season, and the barn roof would always need watching, and there would be hard winters and harder decisions and moments she'd handle wrong and have to go back and handle differently. She was not at the end of something. She was in the middle of it, which was the only place anyone ever actually was. But she was in the middle of it here, in a place she'd built and fought for, with a man who had taken her hand when no one else would have, and turned out to be worth every difficult thing that came with him. She was in the middle of it as someone she recognized, not the woman the valley had decided she was, not the woman she'd been afraid she might be, but herself, actual and specific and harder to underestimate than she'd once been. The fire held. The mountain held outside the window, indifferent and enormous and permanent, the way it had always been. She thought, all right then. The same words she'd thought walking out of that meeting hall over a year ago into air that smelled like pine and stone and nothing like the inside of the hall. All right then. Whatever comes next. She still meant it. She meant it more.